Cowboy gave his only horse to a wounded Apache woman. What she offered him was beyond imagination. The desert was a sun-bleached bone orchard, a godless expanse that radiated loneliness, simmering regret, and a profound, crushing silence. Jake tipped the last canteen to his lips, rationing the final warm drops as he scanned the skeletal horizon. He was a man whittled down to pure grit, a ghost haunting himself across the endless flats running from a past that had more teeth than any predator. Every gust of wind carried a phantom sound, a child's laughter abruptly silenced. It was a debt he could never repay, a failure that had chased him clean out of the civilized world. Then he saw it, a smudge of color against the bleached rock, not a trick of the heat. It was a woman, still and broken, an Apache. As he drew closer, he saw the dark stain of blood on her buckskin dress. He had only one horse, his last tie to survival, and as he stared, he knew this unforgiving land was offering him a choice: save her, or save himself. The devil was calling in his marker. The sun was a hammer, and the anvil was Jake's skull. Below him, the desert stretched out like a sun-bleached bone orchard, a godless expanse that radiated loneliness, simmering regret, and a profound, crushing silence. His horse, a flea-bitten gray named Dusty, let out a low groan, her ribs a washboard of dust and exhaustion. "I know, girl," Jake rasped his own voice, a stranger's crackle. He ran a hand down her neck, the hide hot and trembling. Just a little further. It was a lie. They both knew it. There was no further. There was only this, an endless shimmering sea of heat and rock. He tipped the last canteen to his lips, rationing the final warm drops. A single bead of sweat traced a path through the grime on his face. He was a man whittled down to pure grit, a ghost haunting himself across the endless flats. Every gust of wind, hot as a furnace blast, carried a phantom sound that had chased him for 1,000 miles. A child's laughter abruptly silenced. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and he squeezed his eyes shut. It was a debt he could never repay, a failure that had driven him from the world of men and into this purgatory. He was here to disappear, to let the land scour him clean down to the sinew. But the ghosts had followed. Then he saw it. At first it was just a smudge of color against the bleached rock, a distortion in the wavering heat. Not a town, not a trick of the light. Hope, a feeling so foreign it was painful, flickered in his chest. He nudged Dusty forward, his heart hammering a weak, frantic rhythm. It was a woman. She lay in the scant shade of a granite boulder, as still and broken as a discarded doll. An Apache. Her buckskin dress was torn, one shoulder stained with a dark, ugly bloom of dried blood. Her black hair was a tangled mat against the pale dust, but her face, even in unconsciousness, was set in a mask of hard pride. Her hand was clenched tight around a single black eagle feather. Jake reined Dusty in a cold, practical voice, hissing in his mind. "Ride on. This ain't your business. An Injun is trouble you can't afford." She was a death sentence. Helping her was suicide. He had nothing left but the horse beneath him, and the animal was his last tie to survival. He started to turn Dusty away, the creak of the saddle leather screaming betrayal in the silence. But his eyes snagged on her face again, on the faint bluish tint to her lips, on the shallow, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. He saw another face, pale and small, gasping for a breath he couldn't provide. Damn it all to hell, he breathed the words, a surrender. He slid from the saddle, his boots sinking into the hot sand. His knees ached as he knelt beside her. He uncorked his personal flask, the last of the water, and gently touched the cool metal to her lips. Her eyes flew open. They weren't the eyes of a victim. They were black, fierce, and full of a fire that defied the dying body that housed them. There was no plea in them, only suspicion, only defiance. She flinched from his touch, a low growl forming in her throat. Easy now, Jake said, his voice softer than he'd intended. Just water. Drink. He held the flask steady. For a long, tense moment, they were locked in a silent standoff, the broken cowboy and the wounded warrior. Finally, her gaze softened by a fraction, and she took a small, hesitant sip. He knew what he had to do. The knowledge was a cold, heavy stone in his gut. It was an insane choice. It was the only choice. With a grunt, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bundle of sharp bones and fierce will. He lifted her onto Dusty's saddle, his own muscles screaming in protest. She slumped forward, her strength gone, her head resting against the horse's mane. He took Dusty's reins and placed them in her limp hand, folding her fingers around the worn leather. "You get on now, girl," he whispered to the horse, his throat tight. "You take her. Find water. You hear me?" Dusty turned her head, her large brown eye fixing on him with an almost human understanding. She nudged his chest, a soft, questioning gesture. Jake stepped back, away from his horse, away from his life, away from his only chance. He was alone. Again. He slapped Dusty's rump, a sharp, final command. The horse startled, then began to walk a slow, steady plod toward the merciless horizon, carrying the woman and all of Jake's worldly hope with her. He watched until they were just a speck disappearing into the shimmering heat. He had traded his life for a ghost's forgiveness. The question was, would the desert come to collect? The silence that followed was a living thing. It was heavier than the heat, vaster than the sky. Jake walked into it, a man unburdened and utterly doomed. For the first time in years, the phantom laughter in his head was quiet, drowned out by the rhythmic crunch of his own boots on the gravelly earth. He had made a choice. The cost was his life, but the payment was a moment of profound, terrifying peace. The peace lasted one day. By the second, the sun had burned away all sentiment, leaving only the raw animal need for water. His lips cracked. His tongue felt thick as old leather in his mouth. The world became a simple, brutal equation of survival. He followed the faint tracks left by Dusty, not with any real hope of catching up, but because it was the only direction he had. A mindless pilgrimage toward a grave he had chosen for himself. On the third morning he found the other tracks. They were fresh, cutting across the trail he was following. 3 riders, shod horses moving with purpose. Not drifters, not lost prospectors. These were hunters. A cold knot of dread tightened in his gut, a feeling far worse than the thirst. He scrambled for cover behind a ridge of sun-scorched rock, his body screaming in protest. He watched as they came into view, 3 dark silhouettes against the blinding glare. The man in the lead was wiry and mean. A face like a hawk's, a long-barreled rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. Jake had seen his type before in 100 dusty towns. A man who enjoyed his work. "He ain't far now," Silas, one of the others, called out, his voice carrying on the thin, dry air. "The horse is slowin'. She's carrying double or the squaw is hurt bad." The leader, Silas, dismounted, kneeling to inspect the trail. He was patient. Precise. He brushed his fingers over a scuff mark in the sand. And this here Silas drawled a cruel amusement in his voice. "Boot prints. A white man's boot. Our trader is on foot, plumb tuckered by the looks of it." He looked up, his cold eyes scanning the landscape as if he could feel Jake's gaze upon him. He gave his horse to a redskin. "Can you believe the gall he's made this a righteous hunt, boys? We ain't just collectin' a bounty. We're deliverin' God's own justice." They laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that the desert swallowed without a trace. They knew. They knew everything. Jake slid back down behind the rock, his heart a cold, heavy stone. This wasn't a random posse. They were hunting him. The bounty wasn't just on her head. It was on his, too. He was a traitor, an accomplice, a dead man walking. The hunt was on. He spent the next 2 days in a blur of terror and exhaustion, moving only at night, hiding during the brutal daylight hours. He became a creature of the shadows, a lizard scurrying from rock to rock. But Silas was relentless. Jake would find their dead campfires still warm. He would see the buzzards circling in the distance, a sure sign they were closing in. He was losing. The desert was winning. His body was shutting down. He collapsed at the base of a skeletal mesquite tree, the world dissolving into a white-hot haze. The thirst was a fire in his throat, his body a useless, aching weight. The phantom laughter returned louder, now mocking him. You failed them. You failed yourself. You die alone. He closed his eyes, ready for the end, ready for the silence to finally take him. Through the haze, a shape shimmered. He thought it was Silas at first coming to deliver the final merciful bullet, or maybe it was an angel, a dark-haired angel of death. The figure grew closer, resolving out of the heat waves. It was her. Nita. She was leading Dusty, who looked weary but unharmed. She had come back. It was impossible. It was a fever dream. She knelt beside him, her face as stoic as the ancient rocks around them, but her eyes held a new light. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. A shared understanding. She unslung a waterskin, his waterskin, and held it to his lips. The water was the most beautiful thing he had ever tasted. It was life. It was forgiveness. You came back, he rasped the words, tearing at his raw throat. She simply nodded, wiping his forehead with a cool, damp cloth she'd produced from a saddlebag. Her touch was gentle, sure. The touch of a healer. Why, he whispered, needing to understand. She looked at him, her dark eyes meeting his, and for the first time he saw not a stranger, not an Apache, but a person bound to him by a debt of sacrifice. A life for a life, she said, her voice quiet but firm. This is the law of the land. My law. Relief so profound it was painful washed over him. He had not died for nothing. But as he struggled to sit up, he saw her gaze shift, looking back over the vast, empty expanse they had crossed. Her expression hardened, the healer replaced in an instant by the hunted. The fire returned to her eyes. The roles had been reversed. He was now the one who was broken, and she was the protector. They come, she whispered, her voice a low, urgent warning. And Jake knew. The desert was no longer their greatest enemy. They come, she said, and the words were not of panic, but of cold, hard fact. For a moment, Jake's world was a simple, brutal choice: fight and die here, or run and die out there. But Nita was already moving. She grabbed Dusty's reins, her small frame radiating an authority that defied logic. She looked at Jake, her eyes commanding, and pointed toward a jagged slash in the distant cliffs, a place that looked less like a path and more like a wound in the earth. There, she commanded. The stone breathes there. They will lose our scent. He didn't understand. He didn't have to. He just had to trust. He stumbled after her, his body a clumsy machine of pain, and followed her into the labyrinth. The world changed instantly. The oppressive open sky was gone, replaced by towering walls of red and orange rock that rose like sleeping giants on either side. The air grew cooler, filled with the scent of dust and stone, and something else, something ancient. Nita moved through the maze with an unnerving grace, her feet finding a path where Jake saw only chaos. She was not a stranger here. She was home. They found their sanctuary in a high alcove hidden behind a curtain of sun-bleached animal bones that hung from a dead, twisted juniper. A small seep spring trickled from the rock, pooling in a shallow basin, a miracle of clear, sweet water. Here, she became the healer. While Jake collapsed, his body finally surrendering to its limits, she worked. She gathered leaves he didn't recognize, crushed roots between stones, and mixed a dark, earthy-smelling poultice. He watched through half-lidded eyes as she tended to the raw blisters on his feet and the angry sun-scorched skin on his neck and face. Her touch was firm, impersonal, yet profoundly gentle. "What is that?" he croaked as she offered him a cup of bitter, steaming tea. She looked at the dark liquid. "Hozona, it is called. Stone root. It quiets the fire in the blood." She spoke the name in her own tongue, first the sounds as natural and elemental as the wind. He drank the bitterness a shock, but a strange quiet strength began to seep back into his limbs. He watched the careful, efficient way she moved the deep knowledge in her hands. He had seen her as a victim, a burden, a debt. Now he saw her for what she was, a force of nature as resilient and knowing as the land itself. The desert was not her enemy. It was her apothecary. That night, under a canopy of stars that looked like cold, distant campfires, they shared a fragile peace. The fire was small, smokeless, built in a way that hid its light. He watched her fingers deftly repair a tear in his shirt with a needle carved from bone and thread spun from a yucca plant. "That feather," he said, his voice quiet. "The one you hold. It means something." She paused her work, her gaze distant. "It was my husband's," she said, her voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "He was a great warrior. He died fighting men like those who hunt us now. So they would not take our children." She said no more, but the story hung in the air, a testament to a loss as deep as his own. He felt a sudden sharp need to offer something in return, a piece of his own brokenness. "I had a daughter," he found himself saying the words tasting of rust and regret. "Her name was Sarah. She had a laugh that sounded like little bells." He stopped the memory, a knife in his gut. It was more than he had said of his past in 5 years. Nita looked at him, her dark eyes holding not pity, but a deep, sorrowful wisdom. She saw more than he was telling. "You carry a ghost," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost part of the wind. "A ghost, not from this land. Its wound is deep." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. How could she know? He recoiled, the walls he had built around his soul suddenly feeling thin as paper. Who was this woman? Before he could answer, her head snapped up. Her body went tense, her gaze fixed on the canyon rim above them. She held up a hand for silence, her nostrils flaring slightly like a deer sensing a wolf. Jake heard nothing but the wind. He saw nothing but the cold, indifferent stars. But he trusted her. Her senses were a part of this land in a way his could never be. She listened for another long moment, her head cocked. A few loose pebbles skittered down the cliff face far above them, a sound so small he would have dismissed it. She did not. Their sanctuary had been found. She looked at him, the brief warmth between them extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard glint of survival. The hunt was not over. Silas was closer than they had ever imagined. She pointed toward a narrow black fissure in the far wall of the canyon, a passage that looked barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. It was a path into darkness. "We go now," she commanded, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Into the canyon of echoes." Her eyes held a new, dangerous light. "If we must fight," she said, "we will let the mountain fight with us." The canyon of echoes swallowed them whole. It was a claustrophobic fissure in the earth, a passage so narrow the sky was reduced to a bruised purple ribbon far above. The air was dead and still, and every sound, the scuff of Jake's boot, the soft jingle of Dusty's bridle, was caught and thrown back by the stone walls, distorted into the whispers of ghosts. "A tomb," Jake muttered, his hand resting on the worn grip of his Colt. Nita paused, placing a hand on the cold living rock. "A tomb for them," she corrected, her voice a low murmur that the canyon seemed to embrace rather than echo. "For us, it is a drum. The mountain knows its own. Stay close. Do as I do." They found a defensible spot high on a narrow ledge concealed by a jagged outcrop of granite. From here they could see the canyon entrance, a gaping mouth waiting to devour their pursuers. They waited. The silence pressed in a physical weight. For Jake, it was no longer the silence of regret, but the coiled, watchful silence of a predator. He was no longer prey. He was fighting for more than just his own skin. He was fighting for the flicker of peace he'd seen in this woman's eyes. Then came the sounds. The arrogant laughter of Silas's men multiplied by the canyon walls into a chorus of demons. Spread out, Silas's voice boomed a godlike roar that seemed to come from every direction at once. They're in this rat maze somewhere. Find the traitor and his squaw. Jake instinctively raised his rifle, but Nita placed a firm hand on his arm. Not yet, she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. Let them get lost first. She put her fingers to her lips and let out a sharp, piercing whistle that mimicked a hawk's cry. The sound struck the canyon walls and shattered, multiplying into a dozen different calls from a dozen different ledges. The men below stopped, their heads snapping around in confusion, rifles raised at phantom threats. What in the hell was that? One of them shouted, his voice tight with fear. Jake understood. This was her battlefield. The mountain was her weapon. Following her lead, he picked up a loose rock and hurled it deep into a side passage. It landed with a loud clatter that the canyon magnified into a rock slide. Gunshots immediately erupted as the posse fired blindly into the darkness, their bullets ricocheting with angry, whining shrieks. They're playing us for fools. Silas roared, his fury echoing through the stone. They're up high climb, I want their heads. The hunt turned vertical. The men began to scramble up the rock faces, their dark shapes moving against the stone. The game was over. The bloodstorm was about to break. Now, Nita said, and this time there was no restraint in her voice. Jake's rifle cracked the sound, a sharp, clean clap of thunder. One of the climbers cried out and fell. Chaos erupted. Gunfire filled the narrow space, the flashes of light illuminating a brutal, desperate ballet of death on the cliffside. Jake moved with a precision he thought he'd lost, a cold fire burning in his veins. He wasn't the haunted man from the desert anymore. He was a protector. He saw one of Silas's men take aim at Nita as she tried to pull Dusty deeper into the shadows of the ledge. Without a thought, Jake threw himself in front of her, a bullet tearing a hot, searing path through his shoulder. He grunted the impact, staggering him, but he stayed on his feet, returning fire. He was a wall, a shield, and in that moment he felt a strange sense of absolution. This was the penance he had been searching for. Silas himself was halfway up the opposite wall, his hawk-like face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. He had Jake pinned down. "You die today, traitor!" he screamed, leveling his rifle. But he had forgotten about Nita. She was not a prize to be protected. She was a warrior. While Silas's attention was fixed on Jake, she moved to the edge of their ledge where a large, precariously balanced pillar of rock stood loosened by 1,000 years of wind and rain. Putting her shoulder to it, she pushed with all her might, a guttural cry torn from her throat. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan that shook the very mountain, the pillar teetered and fell. It crashed down into the narrow passage below, triggering an avalanche of rock and shale. The world dissolved into a deafening roar. One of the hunters was swallowed instantly. Silas, caught on the cliff face, let out a scream of rage and terror as the river of stone swept the ground out from under him, dragging him into the churning darkness. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The canyon fell silent, the air thick with choking dust. The path below was gone, buried under tons of rock. They were alive. They were safe. Jake leaned heavily against the rock wall, the strength finally draining from him. His shoulder was a universe of pain. He looked at Nita, her face streaked with dust, her chest heaving. Their eyes met across the small ledge, and a silent pact was sealed in blood and stone. The adrenaline began to fade, and a cold, creeping darkness started to cloud the edges of his vision. The world tilted. "Jake?" He heard Nita say, her voice suddenly sharp with a new kind of fear. He tried to answer, but his lips wouldn't form the words. The last thing he saw was her face, her fierce warrior's mask crumbling into one of profound concern as she rushed toward him. The mountain had fought for them, but it always demanded a price. Darkness, then pain, then a voice soft as falling leaves weaving through the fevered haze of his mind. Jake was adrift in a red sea of agony. He was vaguely aware of movement, of the gentle sway of Dusty's back beneath him, of a small, strong hand holding him steady in the saddle. The world was a blur of stone and sky, a nightmare painted in the harsh colors of the sun. The canyon walls seemed to lean in, whispering his failures, their shadows twisting into the forms of the men he had killed and the family he had lost. The phantom laughter of his daughter echoed in the emptiness, no longer a memory, but a torment. He was burning from the inside out. He didn't know how long they traveled. Hours bled into a timeless agony. Then a new sound cut through the delirium, the gentle, rhythmic splash of falling water. The air grew cool and damp, smelling of moss and wet earth. He felt himself being lowered, his body a dead weight, onto something soft. Through a slit in his swollen eyelids, he saw where they were. It was a grotto, a hidden sanctuary tucked behind a thin veil of water that cascaded down the cliff face. Sunlight filtered through the waterfall dappled the interior with a soft, ethereal glow. The walls were covered in a faintly phosphorescent moss, casting a gentle green light on ancient pictographs painted in ochre and charcoal images of great hunts of spirits dancing of a world before men like him had come to scar it. It was a holy place, a place of peace, and it terrified him. On one wall, a painting depicted a man fallen, reaching for a star while a small child looked on. Jake's breath hitched. It was his own soul, painted on a rock 1,000 years ago. Nita was by his side. She had cleaned the bullet wound, her touch miraculously deft, and packed it with a poultice of crushed green leaves that drew the fire from his flesh. But she knew with an instinct that went deeper than medicine that his true wound was not in his shoulder. "The body bleeds," she murmured as if to the spirits of the grotto, "but the soul hemorrhages. The ghost you carry must be given its voice so it can find its peace." He tried to protest, to say he didn't believe in such things, but his tongue was a leaden weight in his mouth. He was helpless, a child. And in the face of her calm certainty, his lifetime of cynicism felt like a boy's flimsy armor. He had to trust her. There was nothing else left. She prepared a small bitter-smelling tea over a smokeless fire of dried mesquite root. Her movements were a ritual, her low, soft, chanting a current that seemed to pull him deeper into this strange, sacred dream. She held the cup to his lips. "Drink," she commanded gently. "Do not be afraid. The mountain will show you the path home." He drank. The liquid was earthy, tasting of roots and rain and time. He lay back, and the grotto dissolved. He was standing in front of a small sod house on the plains of Nebraska. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue. He could smell wood smoke and his wife's baking bread. And then he heard it, the sound that had both haunted and sustained him. Papa Sarah, his daughter. She was running toward him through a field of wildflowers, her hair a tangle of sun-bleached gold, her laugh like a string of tiny silver bells. He saw the scene with an impossible, heartbreaking clarity. He saw the stray riders on the horizon. He saw the spooked cattle. He saw the choice he made to protect his stock instead of his home. He lived it all again. The thunder of the stampede, the splintering of wood, the single terrified scream that had been swallowed by the chaos. He felt the crushing weight of his failure, the self-loathing that had been his only companion for years. But this time it was different. The ghost of his daughter did not accuse him. She simply stood before him in the field of memory, her small hand reaching for his. A profound, unconditional love radiated from her. And through the vision, Nita's voice came to him, a gentle whisper on the wind. "You could not stop the storm, Jake. You only blamed yourself for the rain. You have carried this pain long enough. Let her go. She is at peace. Let her go." He fell to his knees in the phantom dirt of his own past, and for the first time since that terrible day, he wept. He wept for his wife, for his daughter, for the man he had been. Great, shuddering sobs that tore from the deepest, most wounded part of his soul. The gift was not gold. It was not a map to a hidden treasure. It was this, the terrible, beautiful, cleansing grace of forgiveness. He awoke slowly. Sunlight, pure and clean, streamed into the grotto. The fever was gone. The burning in his shoulder had been replaced by a dull, clean ache, but the gnawing, relentless agony in his spirit, it was gone. He felt light. Nita was sitting by the fire watching him. Her face was weary, but her eyes were serene. A silent, profound understanding passed between them. He had been seen. He had been healed. He was whole again. The grotto was a sanctuary, a womb from which he had been reborn. But the world outside the world of men like Silas had not changed. He was healed. But were they free, Nita? He said, his voice clear and steady for the first time. What now? They left the grotto at sunrise. The world outside the waterfall's veil was born anew. The air washed clean by the night's violence, and the spirit's passage was crisp and tasted of wet stone and sage. The light that struck the canyon walls was no longer a hammer, but a painter's brush touching the rock with hues of soft gold and rose. The land was the same, but Jake saw it through different eyes. It was no longer a godless expanse. It was simply home. He walked with a clean, dull ache in his shoulder, but the heavier phantom weight on his soul was gone. He felt hollowed out, but not empty. He felt still. For the first time, the silence around him was not a crushing loneliness, but a quiet, companionable peace. Nita led the way, Dusty trailing behind her, their pace unhurried, deliberate. They were no longer running from anything. They were walking towards something. By midday, they reached a crossroads, a place where their small canyon opened into a wider valley. One path snaked south toward the distant, hazy shape of civilization, toward towns, sheriffs, and the long, unforgiving memory of men like Silas. The other path veered west, climbing deeper into the rugged, untamed heart of the mountains. The choice hung in the air, silent and immense. Jake looked down the southern trail. He saw his old life there, a world of cheap whiskey, meaningless bounties, and the ever-present ghost of his own making. A world that had already branded him a traitor and would hang him for it. "I can't go back there, Nita," he said, his voice even. "That world, it ain't mine anymore." Nita looked north toward the lands of her people. A deep sadness touched her features, a shadow in the bright sun. "My world is ashes," she said, her voice a quiet lament. "The blue coats burned our winter camp. My people are scattered like seeds in a great wind. There is no home to return to." They were two ghosts standing at a crossroads between a world that had cast them out and a world that no longer existed. All they had was each other and the weary horse that had bound their fates together. "So what do we do?" Jake asked the question, not one of despair, but of simple, honest fact. "Where do we go?" Nita turned from the ashes of her past and looked to the future, to the hard, unwritten mountains of the West. A flicker of something ancient and resilient sparked in her eyes. "My grandfather, the shaman, spoke of a place," she began, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a half-forgotten legend. "A valley hidden so deep in the mountains that even the eagles sometimes lose their way. A place the spirits protect. He called it the heart of the mountain, where the water is always sweet and the grass is always green. She met his gaze, her expression a challenge and an invitation. It is a long journey, a hard one, but it is a place to begin again. Jake looked at her, at this impossible woman who had faced death and loss and who still spoke of beginnings. He looked down the trail to his past, a road of dust and ghosts. Then he looked at the path she offered, a trail into the unknown. A slow smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. "I've been running my whole life, Nita." He said the words, a final confession. "I'm tired of running. I'd rather walk toward something for once." He nodded toward the mountains. "Lead the way." Their journey was one of silent partnership. He used his strength to clear the paths. She used her knowledge to find them. They moved as one, a new and strange tribe of two. And when they finally saw it, Jake understood. The valley was a miracle, a slash of impossible green nestled in a fortress of granite peaks. A crystal-clear river snaked through a meadow teeming with wildflowers. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and rich earth. It was the heart of the mountain. It was a place to build. The story does not end with them riding off into the sunset. It ends with a beginning. Weeks later, Jake stood shirtless in the sun, his hands once calloused by rains, and a revolver's grip now calloused by stone and timber. He was laying the foundation for a small cabin near the river. Nita was a short distance away, her hands in the soil, planting the seeds she had carried with her corn squash and beans, the three sisters of her people. Dusty grazed peacefully in the meadow, a simple horse, now not a symbol of escape. Jake lifted a heavy river stone, its surface smooth and cool. He looked at the foundation he was building, solid and real. He looked at Nita, a silhouette of profound strength against the green earth. He had given away his horse, his only possession, his last tie to a broken world. But the mountain had given him back a world in return. And here, in the heart of it, he finally began to build.